I thought I was just patching a few shingles and heading home. I didn't expect to meet a woman who'd been quietly holding her world together with duct tape, coffee, and second chances. What started as a 2-day roofing job turned into the kind of connection that makes you question everything you thought you knew about timing, love, and what it means to stay. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It was early spring, one of those mornings where the wind was still cold, but the sun made you believe in better days coming. I'd just pulled off Highway 8 and followed a gravel road that curled around a wooded ridge. This place, Mapleview, was barely a town. More like a name on a sign with a gas station, a church, and a few mailboxes rusting in front of weathered fences. Her house sat at the end of a quiet lane, 2 stories, white trim, roofline sagging just a little too much over the porch. When I pulled in, I expected the usual homeowner, someone polite, maybe distant. The kind of job where I show up, keep my head down, and leave without anyone remembering my name. I didn't expect her. She stepped out as I killed the engine. Light blue flannel shirt over a plain black tee, gray streaks in her tied-back hair, and this way of standing like she'd seen some storms and figured out how to walk through them. Confident, calm, but with something tired behind her smile. The kind of tired that doesn't come from a bad night's sleep. "You must be Owen," she said. "That's me," I replied, hopping out of the truck. "You must be Claire." She nodded and glanced up at the roof. It started leaking last fall, but I convinced myself it was just the gutters. It wasn't. Her voice was warm, like someone who didn't talk just to fill silence, but meant every word when she did. I noticed her hands were tucked into her sleeves even though it wasn't that cold. "Can I take a look?" I asked. She stepped aside, motioning toward the ladder I could already see leaning against the shed. "All yours. I'll be inside if you need anything. Coffee's fresh." Most clients don't say that. Most don't wait on the porch while I climb either. But Claire did. I went up and started the usual inspection. Flashing, underlayment, patches from a quick fix probably done years ago. Half the ridge cap was loose. Whoever built this roof didn't plan on the weather having opinions. It was going to take more than a patch. I worked quietly, noting what I needed. After about 15 minutes, I climbed down and walked around, to where she stood on the porch, holding 2 mugs. "Hope you take it with cream," she said, offering one. I blinked. "You didn't have to." She smiled. "You looked like a cream guy." I took the mug and leaned against the railing. The coffee was just right. "You've got water damage near the chimney," I said. "Some of the boards under the shingles are soft. You'll want the ridge resealed too." She nodded like she already knew it. "How bad?" "Couple days, maybe 3. Claire took a sip from her mug and stared out at the trees lining her backyard. "That's fine," she said. "I've got nowhere to be." There was something in the way she said it. Like the words were heavier than the air around them. I could have ignored it. Could have gone back to the truck, printed an estimate, stuck to the job. But I didn't. "Been here long?" I asked. 8 years, she replied. "Moved in after my divorce. Said I'd fix the place up. I've been saying that for 7 years?" I chuckled. "Life gets in the way." "Yeah," she said. "Or sometimes we just get tired." She looked at me, not in a deep, staring way, but like she was measuring whether she could say more. Then, just like that, she turned and went back inside. That first day, I started pulling shingles and clearing the rot. Every now and then I'd glance down and see her through the kitchen window, moving around slowly. I could tell she wasn't rushing anything. And that was different. There wasn't music blaring. No TV in the background. Just the quiet rhythm of her life moving at a slower speed. At noon, she stepped out again with a plate. "Sandwiches," she said. "If you don't take a break, your back will make you." I almost laughed, but the way she said it made me realize she wasn't joking. I took the plate. Ham and Swiss, homemade bread, a slice of apple next to it. She handed me a folded napkin like I was in a restaurant. I sat on the tailgate of my truck and she sat on the porch step, not beside me, not far, just there. We ate in silence, not awkward, not tense, just quiet. That was day 1. And by the time I left that evening, something strange had happened. I wanted to come back. The second day started with a forecast and a hesitation. I was halfway through loading my tools when the sky broke open and poured like it had been holding its breath for weeks. Not a slow drizzle, not a light mist, a proper roof-stopping downpour. By the time I got to Claire's place, the clouds had turned the morning into a deep gray, and the edges of her lawn were already thick with puddles. I didn't even get out of the truck at first. I just sat there watching the windshield wipers swipe away the mess in rhythmic annoyance. But even through the blur, I saw her. Claire stood on the porch, hood up, arms folded, a mug of something, steaming cupped in both hands. She didn't wave, didn't shout. She just nodded once like she was saying, "Yep, figured this would happen." It wasn't disappointment. It was more like patience. The kind that comes from people who've learned not to argue with life. I killed the engine and jogged through the rain, already soaked by the time I got under the overhang. I told her we wouldn't be doing much roofing today, brushing water off my jacket as she tilted her head and smiled. She offered to let me come inside and dry off. Now, there's something I should admit about myself. I don't usually say yes to things like that. I've been doing this job for almost 15 years, and 99% of the time, I finish the work, take the check, and leave without ever seeing the inside of someone's living room. Not because I'm rude, just because I like the distance. It's simple, clean, but something about Claire made no feel like the wrong word, so I followed her in. Her house smelled like cinnamon and cedar. Not the kind from scented candles. Real wood, real baking. It was warm in a way that made you forget the world outside was flooding. She handed me a towel from the hallway closet, then pointed toward the kitchen and told me to sit, like I was one of the dogs she didn't own, but probably should have. The kitchen was small, but every surface told a story. A chipped mug painted with someone's childhood handprint. A fridge with magnets from places I guessed she hadn't been to in a while. An old radio playing jazz low enough to be background, but loud enough to let you know someone lived here. I sat at the table, toweling off, and she set another mug in, front of me. This one was darker, heavier, black coffee, no cream this time. She smirked, saying she had to keep me guessing. We talked. Nothing important at first. Weather, traffic, how small towns always have a main street and a bakery that hasn't changed its menu since 1986. She told me she used to be a teacher, retired early when things got complicated. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't push. Something in her tone said later maybe, or maybe not at all. At some point, I noticed the rain had stopped. Sunlight was creeping through the window blinds, lighting up the countertop. But I didn't move. Neither did she. Instead, she brought over a tin of old photos and set it on the table without explanation. I looked at her. She nodded and told me to pick one. So I did. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first one I pulled was a beach snapshot. Her, younger, hair, shorter, laughing with someone just out of frame. She looked like someone who had figured out how to be happy without asking permission. There was another photo of her in a concert crowd, hands up, eyes closed, lost in the music. Another of her in hiking boots at the edge of a canyon, squinting into the sun. I told her she had lived. She shrugged and said we all had. I told her most people didn't have the pictures to prove it. She smiled, but this time it was smaller, sadder. She said she'd stopped collecting them after a while. Memories started feeling like receipts. That line stuck with me. I didn't say anything for a long time after that. Just sipped my coffee and listened to the rain starting up again, softer now, more like a rhythm than a warning. Eventually, she cleared the table and pulled out a deck of cards. She asked if I knew how to play gin rummy. I said I did. She asked if I was any good. I told her I wasn't bad. She said I was about to be humbled. We played for a while. Maybe an hour. Maybe 2. Time moves differently in rooms like that. Rooms with no clocks, no agendas, and no one waiting for you to leave. She beat me 3 games to 1. I told her I let her win. She told me I was full of it. At some point, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, sighed, and flipped it over screen down. She told me it was her sister, said she meant well, but thought Claire needed to get out more. I told her maybe she did. She raised an eyebrow and said, maybe she just needed to let more people in. And I'll be honest, my chest did a thing in that moment. Not big, not fireworks. Just a shift. Like something inside me realized it had been holding a breath for too long. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what, so I stood up and stretched, said the rain had lightened up and I should head out. She didn't try to stop me, just walked me to the door, handed me the mug again, and said to keep it, for luck, or at least for my truck. I took it. She stood, in the doorway, watching me jog back through the drizzle, one hand on the doorframe, the other tucked into her sleeve like before. As I drove off, I checked the rear view. She was still standing there. The third day was dry, but the roof stayed, untouched. It wasn't intentional. I'd pulled up with my gear like always, ready to make use of the clear sky and mild breeze. But something in the air, or maybe in her eyes, told me we wouldn't get much done. Claire was already outside when I arrived, seated on the porch, with a notebook in her lap and her hair tied up in a loose bun that looked like it had been thrown together without much thought. She waved when she saw me but didn't rise. I got out, stretched my back, and walked toward the house. I could feel something in her silence. Not sadness, not exactly, but a quiet preoccupation, like a tune she was humming that I couldn't hear. We exchanged a few words, but nothing stuck. She mentioned something about errands she needed to run later, and I mentioned that I'd need to make a supply run into town after lunch. It was small talk, the kind that filled the space between two people who weren't quite strangers anymore but didn't know what they were yet either. I got to work, hammer in hand, perched at the ridge. My body moved on autopilot, measuring, prying, lifting, lining up. But my thoughts kept drifting to the woman inside, the one who seemed to live in chapters rather than sentences. She fascinated me, not because she was loud or magnetic, but because of the opposite. There was a steadiness to her, like watching a river from the shore. You couldn't always see the current, but you knew it was there. By noon, my hands were covered in grit, and sweat had soaked the back of my collar. I climbed down and walked, around to the porch, half expecting her to be gone. But she was still there, now with her feet tucked beneath her on the bench, and her notebook closed beside her. When she looked up, something about her expression had softened. She asked if I was hungry, and I nodded. She didn't ask what I wanted. She just stood, walked inside, and I followed. Inside, she moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency. There was no sense of hosting, no theatrics, just two people in the same space, breathing the same air, allowing the silence to do most of the work. She made grilled cheese, simple and perfect, the kind where the bread has that golden crispness that speaks of patience and butter, not rush. We sat at the kitchen table again, the same two mugs between us, and ate with a kind of stillness that had begun to feel familiar. At some point, I looked up from my plate and caught her watching me, but not in the way that makes a person self-conscious. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a challenge. It was just presence. I told myself not to read into it. People watch. People wonder. That didn't mean anything more than what it was. After lunch, I told her I needed to grab a few things from town and offered to pick up anything she needed while I was out. She hesitated for a moment, then scribbled a short list on the back of a receipt and handed it to me. Nothing unusual. Tea, batteries, some kind of almond crackers I hadn't heard of. But the act itself felt like a thread being offered. Trust, in its smallest form. I took the list, told her I'd be back within the hour, and headed into town. The hardware store was slow, and the grocery store slower. I found myself checking my watch more than once. Not because I was in a hurry, but because I wasn't. I wanted to get back. That realization hit somewhere between the checkout line and the parking lot. When I returned, she was on the porch again, this time barefoot, her feet curled under her on the bench cushion, a book in her lap and a blanket around her shoulders. I handed her the bag of groceries, and she gave a small smile of thanks, barely glancing at the contents. She didn't need to check. She trusted I'd gotten it right. I sat on the top step while she tucked the crackers into a tin and brewed a pot of tea. When she returned, she handed me a mug without asking and sat down beside me. We watched the trees sway and listened to the sound of wind against wood. At one point, she spoke. Not about anything big, just a memory of her father building a shed. In their backyard, the way he used to whistle when he worked. The way he could never sit still for more than 10 minutes. I listened and nodded and let the moment be whatever it was meant to be. As the light started to fade, I realized I hadn't touched the roof since the early morning, but I didn't care. Some jobs are measured in hours and invoices. Others are measured in connection. And this was starting to feel like the latter. Eventually, I stood and said I should head home. She didn't protest. Just walked me to the truck like the day before and told me to drive safe. No jokes. No teasing. Just a quiet, genuine tone that wrapped around me like a second skin. I got in, turned the key, and pulled away slow. In the rear view, I saw her turn back toward the house, the porch light flickering on behind her. And as I drove into the dusk, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, this was more than a roof job. Maybe I was being rebuilt too, one quiet moment at a time. By the fourth day, the work had settled into rhythm, but the rhythm itself no longer felt like the point. The roof was getting there, old shingles stripped, the underlayment replaced, the ridge sealed tight, but every time I glanced down from the ladder and saw Claire moving around inside that house, I realized the job wasn't what had started to matter. The hours were filled with tasks, yes, but the space between them was where everything lived. I arrived mid-morning, as usual, and found her kneeling in the garden bed along the side of the house, hands buried in soil, sleeves rolled, up to her elbows, and a calm on her face that made it seem like she could stay there all day without ever needing a reason to get up. The porch light was off, the house windows open to let in the fresh air, and the faint sound of that same old jazz record drifting out, warbling and worn. It felt like the kind of morning that asked nothing from anyone. Just permission to exist. Set up my tools and climbed onto the roof. But my mind didn't stay with the measurements. It wandered. Down to the way her hair had started to loosen around her face as she worked in the garden. To the smudge of dirt across her cheek. To the gentle, unhurried care she gave to things that no one else would probably notice. Tiny weeds pulled by the root. Loose stones realigned along the border. The kind of effort that wasn't for show. I couldn't explain why any of it meant something to me, but it did. Maybe because I've spent most of my life around temporary things. Quick jobs, short stays, motel rooms with stiff beds and paper-thin curtains. Most places I go are meant to be left. But this one wasn't asking me to leave, at least not yet. Around noon, I took a break and sat on the roof's edge, feet dangling above the porch, sweat drying on my neck. She noticed me from below and looked up, shielding her eyes with one hand. I nodded. She nodded back. That was it. No words. Just a shared glance, like we both knew we didn't need to explain anything. Eventually, I climbed down, drank some water, and wandered around to the side where she was still working. She was planting something new. Flowers, maybe, or herbs, I couldn't tell. But her hands moved like they remembered how to do this, even if she hadn't tried in a while. I leaned against the fence and watched for a while. She didn't ask why I wasn't working. I didn't offer an excuse. The sun shifted higher, and the heat thickened. But the breeze off the trees kept everything bearable. Later that afternoon, as I worked near the chimney, I noticed something tucked under one of the broken shingles. A folded scrap of paper, yellowed with age, brittle at the edges. I opened it carefully. It was a handwritten grocery list, but not hers. The handwriting was clumsy, large letters written in crayon. Milk, cereal, apples, Band-Aids, peanut butter. And then, at the bottom, a name. Alex. I brought it down when I finished the section and handed it to her without saying anything. She held it, stared for a moment too long, and then walked inside. I thought maybe I had crossed a line. But when she returned, she didn't seem upset. Just far away. She told me it was from her son. Years ago. He used to leave her notes like that after school. Tiny errands scrawled with pride. The way kids think they're helping when they tell you what to buy. She said he moved away a long time ago. Some things were complicated, others weren't. He called on holidays, sometimes birthdays. But there were years between those calls now. Life had drifted between them like fog, not hostile, just distant. She wasn't bitter when she said it, just factual. Like she'd already had the conversation in her head 100 times and knew there were no clean answers. The day wound down slowly, the light stretching golden across the yard. I packed up my tools and stood in the driveway for a moment, unsure whether to leave or linger. She stepped out onto the porch with 2 glasses in her hands. Iced tea this time, not coffee. She motioned toward the bench. I sat. We drank in silence, and for once I wasn't in a rush to fill it. There was something sacred in the quiet, in the way the ice clicked against glass, in the creak of the wooden steps beneath our weight. She asked me if I ever got tired of going house to house, job to job, never really planting roots. I told her I didn't know. Some days, it felt like freedom. Other days, it felt like exile. She nodded, like she understood both. Then she said something that sat with me all night. She said, "Sometimes people aren't meant to stay in one place, but they still need to be seen by someone who does." I didn't know how to answer that, so I didn't. I just looked out at the trees. When I finally left, the porch light came on automatically behind her, casting her in a soft halo as she stood there barefoot, one hand still holding her glass, the other brushing back a strand of hair. I pulled out of the drive slowly, and when I looked back this time, she wasn't watching me. She'd already turned toward the door. Somehow that felt like trust, like she didn't need to keep her eyes on me to know I'd be back. The work continued, but something else was beginning to take shape alongside it. Something quieter, harder to name, and not bound to any schedule or checklist. I arrived early that morning, earlier than usual, not because the job demanded it, but because the stillness around her house had begun to feel like a place I wanted to start my day. The driveway was shaded by tall pines, and dew still clung to the blades of grass, catching the sun in a way that made the whole yard glow. I stepped out of the truck and let the door close without a slam, almost instinctively keeping the quiet intact. Claire was already outside, sitting cross-legged on the porch with a cup of tea balanced on one knee and a notepad resting on the other. Her eyes were on the horizon, not in a dreamy or distracted way, but like she was waiting for something to arrive. When she noticed me, she didn't move, just offered a small smile, the kind you give someone you're used to seeing, not out of obligation, but out of comfort. I set my gear down on the grass and paused before starting. The roof could wait. There was a kind of hush in the air that asked for stillness, not hammering. I took a seat on the step below hers and looked out, in the same direction, though I wasn't sure what I was looking for. We sat like that for several minutes without speaking. There was a rhythm to it now, a kind of mutual understanding that not every moment needed words to be full. Eventually, she broke the silence by asking if I'd ever lived in one place long, enough to watch the seasons change properly. Not just notice the leaves or the cold, but really feel the slow turning of things. I told her I hadn't, at least not in any way that mattered. She nodded as if that confirmed something she already suspected. She said there was a kind of wisdom in things that stayed rooted, even when life kept asking them to move. I didn't reply right away, but the thought stuck with me as I stood and returned to the roof. Throughout the afternoon, I worked steadily, the kind of focused labor that comes less from urgency and more from clarity. I wasn't rushing to finish, but I wasn't dragging it out either. I just wanted it to be done right. The wind picked up as I nailed the final row of shingles along the east side, and I caught the scent of her cooking drifting up from the open kitchen window. Onions, maybe garlic, something sautéing slowly. It was grounding in a way I hadn't expected, that smell, like a thread pulling me back into something older and more familiar than memory. Around mid-afternoon, she brought out a pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses, setting them on the table beneath the shade of the porch awning. I climbed down, wiped the grit from my hands, and joined her without being asked. We sat across from each other, and she poured without ceremony, as if this had been part of the job all along. She told me a story about her mother, how she used to wake up before dawn just to sit on the porch with a cigarette and a notebook, writing letters she never mailed, letters to old friends, old lovers, sometimes to no one at all. Claire said she never read them, not even after her mother passed, but she kept the box they were in, still sealed, in the attic. I asked her why. She said some things weren't meant to be opened. They were just meant to be carried. Her voice didn't crack, but her eyes grew distant. I didn't press. I simply listened, nodding, letting the weight of it land without needing to fix it. Later, we ended up in the backyard, walking along the edges of the garden where her tomato plants leaned lazily against a wire fence. She mentioned wanting to build a better trellis, something that would hold them up without suffocating them. I offered to help, and she smirked, saying she was starting to think I wasn't very good at leaving projects unfinished. I told her it depended on the project. She didn't laugh, but there was a warmth in her silence. As the light softened into gold and the air took on that early evening hush, I found myself wishing the day would stretch just a little longer, that the shadows would slow down and linger across the lawn. When it was time to leave, I loaded my tools deliberately, moving slower than necessary. She walked me to the truck, same as before. But this time, she didn't stop at the porch. She followed me all the way to the edge of the gravel, barefoot, her arms crossed loosely in front of her, as though she wasn't cold but wanted something to hold. Just before I opened the door, she looked up and asked, not casually, not joking, if I ever wondered what it would feel like to stop moving. I told her I thought about it more than I let on. She didn't say anything else, just stepped back and let me drive away. As I rounded the bend at the end of her road, I glanced once in the mirror. She was still there, standing in the fading light, hair lifted slightly by the breeze, not waving but not leaving either. And as I turned onto the main road, the question she'd asked repeated in my mind, not with urgency, but with gravity, a quiet pull. What would it feel like to stop moving? There was no roof left to fix, not really. The last shingle had been nailed, the sealant had dried clean along the ridgeline, and the gutters had been cleared of every brittle leaf and broken twig. Technically speaking, my job was finished. I could have loaded my tools, said thanks for the lemonade, and been halfway to the next town by the afternoon, but I didn't. I lingered, under the half-excuse of checking the flashing one more time, pretending the downspout needed reinforcement, pretending the ridge vent needed a second look. The truth was harder to articulate, even to myself. I stayed because I wasn't finished. Not with the house, but with whatever was unfolding in the quiet hours I spent on her porch, in her kitchen, by her side. There was something unspoken being built in the stillness between conversations, in the ease of our routines, and I didn't want to leave before I understood what it was. Claire never asked when I'd be done. She didn't bring it up, didn't count the hours or hint at a goodbye. Maybe she felt it too. That hovering sense of something nearing but not yet defined. The days began to feel less like appointments, and more like chapters, each one folding gently into the next, without a hard line between them. That afternoon, she asked if I'd walk with her to the edge of her property, where the trees gave way to a narrow creek that carved a soft channel, between mossy rocks and overgrown roots. We walked side by side, not speaking for the first 100 steps. The path was worn but not cleared, and every now and then she paused to brush aside a branch or step over a tangle of vines. It wasn't a trail so much as a memory of one. When we reached the creek, she sat on a large, flat rock by the edge, and I followed, resting my elbows on my knees and watching the water trickle past in slow, meandering ribbons. She told me this was where she came when the noise got too loud. Even when the house was quiet, the silence could sometimes feel crowded. Out here, she said, things made sense again. The water didn't ask questions, didn't expect anything. It just moved forward. I listened, unsure of whether I was supposed to respond or just receive her words like river stones worn smooth from time. She reached into the shallow water and picked up a pebble, turning it over in her fingers as if it held answers. Then, still not looking at me, she asked if I believed in timing. I said I did, though I wasn't sure I really did until that moment. She nodded, still staring at the current, and said sometimes we meet the right people at the wrong time, and other times we meet the wrong people when we're trying too hard to be right. I didn't know who she was referring to. Me, someone from her past, maybe even herself, but I felt the weight of it anyway. We sat there a while longer before heading back, the walk quieter now, though not in an empty way. It felt like we had both set something down beside that creek, even if we didn't say it out loud. Back at the house, she asked if I wanted to stay for dinner again. I said yes, without hesitation. We made pasta together, chopping vegetables side by side at the counter, her movements graceful and assured, mine slower, more deliberate. She laughed when I cut the onion unevenly, then handed me a better knife without a word. The kitchen filled with the scent of garlic and roasted tomatoes, and by the time we sat down to eat, the day had softened into a low golden glow through the windows. We ate slowly, not because we were savoring the food, though it was good, but because neither of us wanted to reach the end of the meal too quickly. Afterward, we moved to the porch, each with a blanket draped across our laps, the air cool enough now to remind us that summer wouldn't last forever. The stars began to emerge one by one, scattered faintly across the navy sky, and for the first time she asked about the road, not where I was going next, but why I was always going somewhere. I didn't have a poetic answer. I told her I got used to leaving before I was left. She didn't say anything at first, but then she nodded, slowly, as though that explanation didn't surprise her. She said some people wander to forget. Others do it hoping someone will ask them to stay. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, just honest. It stretched long enough that I thought the conversation had ended. But then, without turning to face me, she said it. "Would you stay with me, even if I'm 52? Her voice didn't tremble. It wasn't playful or fishing for compliments. It was a real question, weighted with vulnerability and intention. And it hung in the air between us like the pause at the end of a song. She didn't look at me after she said it. Just stared out at the stars, waiting, not for a promise, but for an answer that wouldn't retreat into vagueness. I didn't speak right away. I couldn't. My chest tightened with the realization that this wasn't just about her age, or romance, or whether I was ready to settle down. It was about showing up fully, about stepping into something that might not be safe or predictable but could be real. So I stayed quiet. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to be sure that when I did, it would be something I could live by. The night didn't end in an answer, and maybe that was the answer she needed. When she stood up and took the empty mugs back inside, she didn't ask again, and I didn't follow right away. I stayed on the porch, the blanket still across my legs, the weight of her words heavier than the stars overhead. It would have been easier if it had been said in jest, one of those flippant lines tossed out to test the air, easily laughed off or ignored. But this wasn't that. This was a moment laid bare, quiet and direct, no hint of apology or disguise. Would I stay? Not for the night, not for the comfort of shared warmth or the ease of companionship, but truly stay, with her, through her years, in a life already carved with solitude and routines and quiet aches that didn't always show. And I knew she wasn't asking for reassurance. She wasn't asking for flattery. She was asking if I had the courage to put down my tools, not just for the day but for good, to stop drifting and start becoming part of something rooted. Inside, I could hear her rinsing the mugs, the water running, a drawer opening and closing. No expectation in her footsteps, no pressure in her movements. But still, the air felt thick with waiting. I stood eventually, folded the blanket, and stepped back into the house. She was in the kitchen, wiping down the counter, her back turned. I didn't say anything, and neither did she. She finished what she was doing, placed the towel neatly over the sink, and looked up at me, not expectantly, not impatiently, but openly. She didn't ask again. She didn't need to. That moment had passed, but it still echoed between us. I nodded once, slowly. Not a commitment, but an acknowledgement of what was now in the air between us. She nodded back and motioned to the hallway. I took the same guest room I had before, and we said goodnight like people who both understood something, had shifted, even if we didn't yet know where it would lead. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay on top of the covers for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of her house settling, the creak of old beams, the hush of trees moving outside the window. I thought about all the places I'd stayed, and all the reasons I'd left, the cities that had blurred into one another, the jobs that had filled my time but never my soul, the nights I'd spent in motel beds, unfamiliar ceilings overhead, wondering if anyone would notice if I just didn't show up to the next one. And I thought about her porch, The garden path, the creek she walked me to, and the way her voice had barely trembled when she asked if I could stay. In the morning, she acted like nothing had happened, and I followed suit. We had coffee in the kitchen, ate scrambled eggs, and talked about things that didn't matter. Weather, the tomatoes that were coming in too slowly this year, the neighbor's dog who barked every time the mail truck drove past. But beneath the lightness was that same slow pull, that question left hanging in the space between us. I offered to help with the trellis she'd mentioned, and she agreed with a half smile, handing me a pair of gloves and leading me out back where the tomato plants drooped against the wire, reaching for something more solid. We worked in a kind of harmony that didn't need instructions. I measured, cut, held the frame while she tied the twine. Our movements synced like a dance learned by feel, not choreography. It was the kind of task that fills time without making it heavy. And by the time we finished, the sun had shifted high above us, casting long shadows behind the posts. She stepped back to admire the work, brushing her hands on her jeans, and I felt a strange rush of pride, not in the structure itself but in the quiet way we'd built it together. She asked if I wanted to stay for lunch, and I said yes, and it felt natural, like the continuation of something already in motion. We ate on the porch, cold chicken and potato salad, the kind of meal that's better not because of what it is, but because of where and how it's shared. She told me about her sister, how they used to fight over everything as kids, who got the bigger bedroom, who got the last word. But now they talked every Sunday like clockwork. I told her about the time I got lost in a snowstorm on a job upstate and had to spend the night in the truck with a space blanket and a half-eaten protein bar. We laughed, not just politely but fully, and I realized how long it had been since I'd done that with someone whose laughter didn't feel borrowed. As the afternoon settled into early evening, the conversation dipped into quiet again. She leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed, the sun catching the strands of gray in her hair like silver threads. I thought about telling her then, about how I hadn't stopped thinking about her question, about how part of me had already answered it, even if my mouth hadn't. But instead, I just sat there and let the silence do what it had been doing so, well, hold us. Because sometimes the most honest response isn't the one you say out loud. It's the one you live into slowly, day by day, until it becomes the truth. Time has a way of folding in on itself when you stop counting it. The hours didn't feel like blocks on a clock anymore, but more like currents in a stream, sometimes slow, sometimes fast, but always carrying us somewhere, even if neither of us said where. I still came by most days, though the roof had long since stopped needing attention. The trellis had been built. The gutters were cleaned. But there was always something else that could use a hand, or at least that's what I told myself. A loose shutter on the west side, a leaky faucet in the guest bathroom, the paint peeling along the windowsill. And even when there wasn't, I found ways to be there, ways that didn't feel like intrusions, but like continuations. Claire never questioned it. She had this way of accepting without expectation, like she knew pushing too hard would only make me retreat. She let me come and go, but the door was always open, literally and otherwise. I started leaving a few tools in the corner of the porch, tucked into a weathered box beside the broom. I kept a flannel shirt on a hook inside the mudroom. It wasn't official, nothing ever was, but those little things began to feel like roots. The kind that grow so slowly you don't realize they're anchoring you until you try to move. One afternoon, I found her in the kitchen, surrounded by recipe cards spread out like old photographs. She was sorting through them, organizing by ingredient or memory, I couldn't tell which. She looked up when I walked in and smiled like I was returning from something instead of just stepping in from the porch. She said she was looking for her grandmother's cobbler recipe, but couldn't remember if she'd written it down or just memorized it the way people used to memorize things they never thought they'd forget. I offered to help, and for the next hour, we sat at the table reading faded index cards in 3 different handwritings, some of them stained with butter or oil, others crisp and untouched like secrets kept too long. We never found the cobbler recipe, but we found her mother's apple crisp, and that seemed to bring just as many stories. She told me how, every fall, they'd drive to this orchard an hour outside of town, fill up brown paper bags with apples, and come home with sticky fingers and a car that smelled like leaves and laughter. I told her about the time I tried to bake something for a girl I thought I loved and ended up filling the entire apartment with smoke because I didn't realize you had to preheat the oven. She laughed, head thrown back just a little, and said, "It wasn't about the food anyway. It was always about the trying." That night she cooked dinner with the windows open, letting the sound of crickets filter in with the scent of garlic and rosemary. I stayed after, washing dishes while she wiped down the counters, our movements again falling into that quiet rhythm that didn't need narration. When the last pan was clean, she poured us each a glass of wine, and we carried them out to the porch where the night had begun to settle like a blanket over everything. The stars were brighter than usual, or maybe I was just finally paying attention. She talked about constellations, not the ones you learn in school, but the ones she made. Up as a child, connecting stars into shapes that only meant something to her. A house, a bird, a woman holding a lantern. She said she used to sit out here as a girl and pretend the sky was sending her messages in code, like the stars were tiny windows into someone else's story. I asked her if she ever decoded them, and she said no, but she liked believing there was something bigger out there that cared enough to whisper. I didn't tell her, but I thought maybe the sky wasn't the only thing trying to say something in silence. Maybe we both were. Eventually the wine was gone, and the quiet stretched long. I stood to go, but didn't move toward the truck right away. Instead, I lingered, one hand on the railing, the other in my pocket, trying to find the words that had been building all week. She didn't speak either. Just looked at me with a kind of softness I hadn't seen before. Not questioning, not hopeful, just present. It was in that moment that I realized how little we'd actually said about what was happening between us, and how much had still been communicated anyway. The gestures, the invitations, the absence of pressure, all of it forming something deeper than declarations. But I also knew this couldn't last in limbo. At some point, one of us would have to name it. I left that night with the porch light still on, casting a warm pool of gold over the steps. In the truck, I sat for a minute before starting the engine, looking back at the house that had somehow stopped being just a house and started to feel like a place that might hold my name. The road ahead felt less certain than ever. Not because I didn't know where to go, but because, for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to go anywhere at all. The next morning didn't bring a grand revelation or a sudden shift. The air was still crisp. The light filtered through the trees in that familiar golden haze, and the world outside continued as if nothing unusual had ever happened within those walls. But something had changed inside me, not in a dramatic way, but in the slow, heavy way that thoughts settle when you've avoided them too long. I got out of the truck a little slower that morning, not because I was tired, but because I was more aware of the ground beneath me. Everything felt sharper. The gravel underfoot, the scent of coffee drifting through the open kitchen window, the way the screen door creaked a little longer before swinging shut. Claire greeted me with the same warmth as always, but I could see it in her eyes too, something unspoken hanging there between us, like a thread pulled taut but not yet snapped. We didn't talk about the question she had asked on the porch, and yet everything we said circled around it like planets around a star. She offered me breakfast, and I accepted. Not because I was hungry, but because refusing would have felt like a withdrawal. We ate quietly, exchanging small observations about the morning, how the garden needed watering, how the birds were more active lately, how the leaves were already beginning to hint at yellow at their edges. It was ordinary. It was safe. But it was also a little too careful, like two people afraid to knock over something fragile that had started to take shape between them. After breakfast, I found myself outside by the shed, pretending to look for something I didn't need. I wasn't ready to go in, and I wasn't ready to leave. I just needed space to think, to breathe, to ask myself the question she had already asked out loud. Would I stay? Could I? Did I even know what that meant anymore? I had spent so long moving from place to place, job to job, person to person, that the idea of permanence felt both comforting and foreign. I leaned against the shed and looked out, over her property, the wild garden she nurtured, the winding path down to the creek, the hammock that swung lazily between two oaks where she sometimes read in the afternoons. I saw a life, full and lived in, not waiting for anyone but quietly ready for someone to join it. The idea that she had made space for me, not with words, but with trust, hit me like a wave I hadn't seen coming. I didn't know when it had started. Maybe the first time she handed me a glass of lemonade without asking if I wanted one. Maybe the moment she let me fix something that didn't really need fixing. Or maybe it was when she stopped asking how long I'd be working on the house and just started telling me what she needed help with next. Whatever it was, it had grown roots. And now I was standing in the middle of it, not as a visitor, but as something else. Something unspoken, but undeniably present. Claire came out a while later, barefoot on the grass, holding 2 mugs of tea instead of coffee this time. She handed me one without comment and leaned against the opposite side of the shed. We didn't face each other, just stood there watching the wind stir the trees. After a long moment, she said she'd been thinking about her mother again. How she used to say that the hardest decisions in life weren't the ones that came with obvious risks, but the ones that looked so safe you almost missed the danger in not choosing at all. I asked her what she meant, and she said there's a kind of quiet heartbreak in letting things drift, in being so afraid of ruining something that you never let it become anything at all. Her voice didn't waver, but I could feel the truth of it settle into the silence that followed. She finished her tea and went back inside, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That afternoon, I took the long way back to the truck, walking the perimeter of the property, touching the fence posts I had repaired, stepping over the cracks in the path I had patched. Every corner of that place had a fingerprint of mine now, not because of the work I'd done, but because of the time I had poured into it. And it wasn't just the house. It was her routines, her laughter, the way she hummed while she cooked, the way she reached for the light switch with her left hand every time, even though it was closer to her right. The quiet resilience in how she kept showing up day after day with no guarantees and no demands. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of staying. I was afraid of what staying would ask of me, of being seen fully, of offering something deeper than help or company, something vulnerable, something real. And I knew I couldn't keep pretending that the question hadn't been asked. I couldn't keep showing up without offering an answer, not for her sake, for mine. Because what scared me more than staying was leaving and realizing I'd just walked away from the one thing that finally felt like it could be mine. It wasn't a dramatic confession that broke the silence between us. It was something quieter, something inevitable, like the way dusk folds into night without asking for permission. I returned the next morning with no excuse, no tool belt, no to-do list. Just me, my hands in my pockets, and that ache in my chest that had been building, slowly ever since she asked me that question under the stars. The porch door creaked open, and she looked up from her seat, where she was nursing a cup of tea and staring out across the garden like she'd been watching something grow beyond what was planted. Her face didn't show surprise or hesitation, just the kind of calm you only find when you've stopped expecting and started accepting whatever might come. I sat down beside her without a word, and we stayed that way for a while. Just 2 people breathing in the same space, letting the minutes pass like waves lapping at the edge of something deeper. The birds were louder that morning, or maybe I was just more aware. Everything had that strange intensity things take on when you know something is about to shift, but you don't yet know how. She didn't press. She didn't ask why I came without my tools. But she knew, and I knew she knew. That was always the thing about her. She had this ability to let you carry your own weight until you were ready to set it down. Eventually, I spoke, not because I had rehearsed anything, but because the words had been simmering long enough to rise on their own. I told her I wasn't good at staying places, that the road had always been my fallback, my comfort, the thing I ran to when anything started to feel too fixed, too real, too fragile. I said that building things was easier than keeping them standing. That hammering nails into wood gave you certainty. Force in, fasten, finished. But people didn't work like that. You couldn't seal up your heart with screws and caulk and hope it didn't leak. She listened without interruption, just nodding every so often, her eyes fixed somewhere. On the horizon, not on me, and yet fully with me. I told her that when she asked me if I would stay, even if she was 52, it wasn't her age that caught me off guard. It was the idea of permanence, of being invited into something I couldn't just patch up and move on from. I said I'd been thinking about it every day since, carrying the question like a stone in my shoe, annoying, unavoidable, and eventually something you had to sit down and deal with before it wore you raw. And then I told her the truth, that I didn't want to leave, that even when I drove away in the evenings, part of me stayed behind on her porch, in her kitchen, by her side. I told her I was scared, not of her, not of commitment, but of finally finding something worth staying for and screwing it up because I didn't know how to be still. Her hand reached out, not to hold mine, but to rest gently on the space between us. Fingers curled slightly like she was offering a ledge, not a cage. She didn't say she needed an answer. She didn't say she was waiting. She just said that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was stop moving long enough to see what had already started to grow. And I realized then that this wasn't about choosing her. It was about choosing myself in a way I never had before. Choosing to show up, to stay when it was easier to disappear, to plant something, even if I wasn't sure I knew how to tend it. The sun crept higher and the shadows shifted across the lawn, and still we sat there, letting the quiet fill in the spaces where fear used to live. She stood eventually, stretched, and asked if I wanted breakfast. I followed her inside and watched her crack eggs into a bowl with practiced hands, humming something under her breath that I didn't recognize but felt familiar anyway. I set the table without being asked, poured the juice, found the butter without opening the wrong drawer. It felt natural, like slipping into a rhythm that had been waiting for me. After we ate, she went out to water the garden, and I stayed behind to clean the dishes. And there, in the simple act of rinsing a plate, I felt something settle inside me. Not certainty, but peace. Not a finish line, but a place to begin. I didn't need to draw up blueprints or make promises I couldn't yet define. I just needed to be here, present, willing. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The days that followed didn't come with fireworks, or confessions, or sudden shifts that made everything clear. And that's what made them matter more. We didn't have any heavy talks or heart-spilling nights that cracked everything open. We just kept moving through the quiet together, living in the spaces where the light filtered soft through the trees, where the sound of the wind in the screen door felt like a rhythm we both belonged to. I kept showing up, no longer under the pretense of repairs, but because the pull toward that house, toward her, had outgrown my excuses. I'd bring coffee sometimes. Sometimes she would. We didn't keep track. I started keeping a book by the bench on the porch. A jacket hung on the hook by the door, my work gloves resting on the second shelf in the shed. And none of it was official, but all of it was real. She taught me how to prune the hydrangeas without hurting them, how to tell when the tomatoes were lying about being ripe, how to sit still long enough to let the dogwoods talk to you through their silence. I taught her how to clean the gutters without killing her back, how to replace a cracked tile without having to call in a contractor, how to strip old paint without stripping the wood's soul. We never said we were teaching each other anything, but it happened anyway, the way rivers shape stone without ever raising their voice. There were mornings when I woke up before the sun and walked the property alone just to feel the earth cool under my boots, to watch the fog lift like breath from the fields, to let the quiet tell me things about myself I'd never heard before. She'd be in the kitchen when I came back, hair pulled up, sleeves rolled, humming something low and warm that made the air feel like it had a heartbeat. I didn't need her to turn around and smile. I didn't need her to ask where I'd gone. It was understood. The porch became our meeting place, the fire pit our soft landing when words felt too big. We cooked together more often, not because it was romantic or planned, but because chopping onions beside someone while arguing over how much garlic is too much has a way of turning strangers into something like home. I noticed the way her laugh lingered longer, the way she talked to the garden like it might answer, the way she paused mid-task sometimes and just breathed, fully, deeply, as if she was learning how to do it again after years of being too cautious. And I think she noticed how I began to soften in the edges, how I started asking questions without fearing the answers, how my footsteps stopped sounding like someone ready to leave. There were little things that shouldn't have meant much but did. The way I left the porch light on one night, even though I wasn't sure if I'd be back the next day. The way she folded the extra blanket and placed it at the foot of the guest bed before I even asked. The way I stopped locking the glove box in my truck, like I wasn't guarding the parts of me that used to stay packed just in case. We never defined what we were building, but it was being built just the same, in shared coffee spoons, in the familiar creak of the back gate, in the silence we didn't rush to fill. One afternoon, as I hammered a loose board on the garden shed, she sat nearby on an old stool with a bowl of snap peas in her lap, shelling them slowly, rhythmically, in a way that sounded like rain on tin. We didn't speak, and we didn't need to. The sound of the hammer, the wind in the leaves, the snap of pea pods, all of it folded into a kind of music I hadn't known I needed until I heard it. When I looked over, she was smiling, not at me, but in that soft way people smile when they realize something is finally becoming what they hoped it could be. And I felt it then, clear as anything. I had already stayed. My body might still leave each evening. My name might not be on the mailbox, but I had stayed in the way that mattered most. In presence, in intention. In every moment I chose to show up without needing to be needed. And the strange thing was, the more I leaned into it, the more I stayed without running, the less it felt like I was giving something up. It felt like I was returning to something I'd left behind a long time ago. Not a place, not a person, but a version of myself I thought didn't exist anymore. Not the drifter, not the fixer, not the guy who always had one foot out the door. Just a man, sitting beside a woman, watching the day unfold with nothing expected and everything received. No contract, no declarations. Just a quiet agreement that whatever this was, it was worth continuing. The rhythm between us continued to unfold, not like a march towards something definitive, but more like a long piece of music where the chorus kept evolving and the melody deepened without needing to be named. Each day wasn't a stepping stone toward an outcome, but a kind of small agreement with the present, showing up, sharing space, listening to whatever the hours had to offer. We didn't talk much about the past, and that silence wasn't avoidance. It was choice. There were things we both carried that didn't need to be unpacked all at once. Memories that still had splinters and jagged edges, and somehow, we respected those quiet barriers without tiptoeing around them. I learned to recognize the slight pause in her voice when something touched a nerve, the way she would stir her tea a little longer than necessary before answering certain questions, the way she sometimes touched her wedding ring finger unconsciously, not out of longing but habit, a remnant of a life lived and lost. She learned, too, to recognize when I drifted, not physically, but internally, when my gaze wandered a bit too far, when I tensed at the sound of a certain song on the radio, when I reached for my keys in moments that didn't call for leaving. But instead of prying, she anchored. A simple glance, a gentle touch, a joke at the right time. Not to pull me out, but to remind me I didn't have to float away. There was a stretch of time where the days were so steady, they almost felt surreal. Coffee in the morning, tending the garden, fixing whatever needed fixing. Long walks down the gravel path to check on the trees that lined the edge of the property, and slow evenings where time melted into golden light and soft air. I began to lose track of how long I'd been showing up, and that felt like progress. Not in the sense of commitment or labels, but in the way a storm loses its edge when it's given enough time to dissipate. One afternoon, we painted the fence. Not because it needed painting, but because she said white fences made everything behind them feel more intentional. She wore a bandana over her hair, smudged green paint on her jeans, and hummed along to some old Motown tune playing on the crackling speaker by the porch. I teased her for being off-key, and she laughed in that way that makes your chest feel like it's got more room in it than before. I caught myself watching her when she wasn't looking, watching the way her smile curved differently when she was focused, the way her eyes softened when she stepped back to inspect the work, the way she moved with this grounded grace that made everything around her feel less uncertain. That night, she made a simple dinner. Roasted vegetables, a loaf of bread she'd pulled from the oven with proud, flour-dusted hands, and a bottle of red wine that had been sitting unopened for years, because she said she never had a reason to celebrate. We didn't toast to anything in particular, but the act of sharing the bottle felt like enough. We sat by the fire pit, the dogs curled at our feet, stars blinking into view one by one. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I wasn't waiting for something to happen. I wasn't counting down to a departure. I wasn't listening for the signal to pack up and leave. I was just there, breathing, eating, laughing, existing in a moment that didn't ask for more than that. She told me about the time she almost moved to Colorado to start over after her divorce, how she'd driven halfway there before turning around because she realized starting over didn't mean running. It meant returning to yourself. I told her about the job I almost took in Alaska, the one that promised triple pay and nothing but silence, and how I'd said no at the last minute because I was tired of building other people's escapes when I hadn't even found my own. We shared these stories like worn pages from a journal we hadn't realized we were still writing. No drama, no wounds reopened, just truth set gently on the table between us. And maybe that's what real connection looks like. Not fireworks or declarations or perfectly timed confessions, but quiet honesty passed back and forth in the safety of shared presence. I didn't ask what we were, and she didn't define it either. But the next morning, I found a fresh cup of coffee waiting for me on the porch before she even came out, and beside it was a folded napkin with the words, "You can start the garden rose today if you want. I trust your spacing." I stared at the note longer than I should have, because it meant more than it looked like. Trust, autonomy, inclusion. The kind of small gesture that says, without saying, that someone sees you not just as a guest but as part of the place itself. And as I sipped the coffee, looking out at the soil we'd been turning over for weeks, I realized something I hadn't admitted yet. Not to her, not to myself. I wanted to be part of the place. Not just the house, or the porch, or the garden, but her world, her rhythm, her mornings, her moments, and I didn't need to say it, not yet. I just needed to keep showing up. The days unfolded like pages of a worn novel, the kind where every chapter doesn't build to a climax, but instead deepens the emotional current in ways that feel invisible, until you stop and realize how far you've traveled. There was a kind of peace in the repetition. Mornings with the scent of brewed coffee and garden soil. Afternoons that hummed with the rhythm of tasks shared in silence. And evenings where the house settled around us like a protective shell against the outside world. She had started to leave me little notes, not grand declarations, but scribbled instructions or observations tucked into the cracks of the day, resting near the tool shed or stuck to the fridge with a mismatched magnet. Sometimes it was a reminder to water the back bed where the rosemary grew wild. Other times it was something softer, like, "Today's light feels different," or, "The sparrows were loud this morning. I think they know something." I started writing back, not directly, but in small actions. I fixed the back gate without being asked. I reorganized the firewood by size and age. I built a shelf in the kitchen where her cookbooks had been piling up. And when she noticed, she smiled in that quiet way she did when words felt unnecessary. There was a comfort in the unsaid, a kind of language neither of us had spoken before, but both of us understood instinctively. And yet, under all of it, there was an ache, not a painful one, but a tension, a current pulling at the corners of the calm we had built. I didn't know what it meant or where it was leading, only that the longer I stayed, the more staying became the only thing I could imagine. I noticed she'd begun moving differently around me. Not performative, not shy but more open, like someone letting themselves exhale a little more deeply each day. She'd dance around the kitchen to old records without asking me to join, fully herself, and somehow that made me want to be more of myself around her. We didn't talk about the future, not about labels or timelines, but we talked about the garden in spring, about where to move the chairs for better morning light, about repainting the shutters when the weather warmed. It wasn't planning in the traditional sense, but it was planting seeds, slow, intentional, wordless commitments. One afternoon, we found an old box in the attic, full of photographs from a life she rarely spoke about. There were pictures of her as a younger woman, laughing on porches, holding babies, standing next to a man I recognized only from a framed photo near the guest room. She didn't offer stories, and I didn't ask for them, but she handed me a few of the photos and said simply, "That was a different version of me." I held them gently, as if they might dissolve, and replied, "I think all the versions brought you here." She didn't cry, but her breath caught, and she looked at me like she was seeing me differently. Not because I said something profound, but because I didn't flinch. Later that evening, she made soup from scratch, the kind of slow meal that fills the whole house with warmth. We ate by candlelight, not because the power was out or because we needed the ambiance, but because it just felt right. The flicker of the flame softened everything. Edges, memories, hesitations. After dinner, I started to wash the dishes, but she stopped me with a hand on my wrist, and in that single touch, something cracked open. We didn't say anything. She just stood there, holding my gaze, and I knew without question that whatever had been growing between us had reached the surface. I leaned in slightly, unsure if I was about to say something or just breathe her in, and she whispered, "I'm not afraid of you breaking something. I'm only afraid you'll disappear before we understand what this is." It landed with more weight than any confession, because it was the exact thing I hadn't been able to say aloud. That fear, that I would ruin this by not knowing how to hold it, or worse, that I would run before giving it a real chance. I didn't answer right. Away, I didn't need to. I stepped closer, not dramatically, just enough to close the space where doubt used to live. My hand brushed hers, fingers curling slowly, and the silence that followed felt like a promise neither of us had to sign. That night we didn't sleep in the same bed. Not yet, but the air in the house was different. Charged, grounded, suspended, somewhere between peace and longing. I lay awake on the guest bed, listening to the creaks in the floor above me, to the occasional cough of the wind outside, and to the steady sound of her footsteps when she checked the window locks before turning in. And I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't measuring the distance between two places. I was starting to feel what it meant to belong. Not to a person, not yet, but to a rhythm, a presence, a life that no longer asked for an exit. It's strange how once something is named, even quietly, without fanfare, it begins to echo louder in the spaces where silence used to live. We didn't talk about that moment in the kitchen, didn't dissect it or drag it into daylight for analysis, but everything after it seemed to hum with a slightly different tone. The air between us felt warmer, heavier, almost charged, like walking through a room after a storm's passed but before the clouds have fully cleared. The next few days unfolded like they always had. Coffee, porch light, garden checks, shared tasks. But the rhythm was different now. Not rushed or awkward, just more aware. She started brushing my arm when she passed by, casually at first, but always deliberately enough that I knew it wasn't accidental. I began leaning closer when we talked, staying just a beat longer when handing her something, letting my gaze linger a second or two beyond. I told her about the job I almost took in Alaska, the one that promised triple pay and nothing but silence, and how I'd said no at the last minute because I was tired of building other people's escapes when I hadn't even found my own. We shared these stories like worn pages from a journal we hadn't realized we were still writing. No drama, no wounds reopened, just truth set gently on the table between us. And maybe that's what real connection looks like. Not fireworks or declarations or perfectly timed confessions, but quiet honesty passed back and forth in the safety of shared presence. I didn't ask what we were, and she didn't define it either. But the next morning, I found a fresh cup of coffee waiting for me on the porch before she even came out, and beside it was a folded napkin with the words, "You can start the garden rose today if you want. I trust your spacing." I stared at the note longer than I should have, because it meant more than it looked like. Trust, autonomy, inclusion. The kind of small gesture that says, without saying, that someone sees you, not just as a guest, but as part of the place itself. And as I sipped the coffee, looking out at the soil we'd been turning over for weeks, I realized something I hadn't admitted yet. Not to her, not to myself. I wanted to be part of the place. Not just the house, or the porch, or the garden, but her world, her rhythm, her mornings, her moments, and I didn't need to say it, not yet. I just needed to keep showing up. The days unfolded like pages of a worn novel, the kind where every chapter doesn't build to a climax, but instead deepens the emotional current in ways that feel invisible, until you stop and realize how far you've traveled. There was a kind of peace in the repetition. Mornings with the scent of brewed coffee and garden soil. Afternoons that hummed with the rhythm of tasks shared in silence. And evenings where the house settled around us like a protective shell against the outside world. She had started to leave me little notes, not grand declarations, but scribbled instructions or observations tucked into the cracks of the day, resting near the tool shed or stuck to the fridge with a mismatched magnet. Sometimes it was a reminder. To water the back bed where the rosemary grew wild, other times it was something softer, like, today's light feels different, or, the sparrows were loud this morning. I think they know something. I started writing back, not directly, but in small actions. I fixed the back gate without being asked. I reorganized the firewood by size and age. I built a shelf in the kitchen where her cookbooks had been piling up, and when she noticed, she smiled in that quiet way she did when words felt unnecessary. We didn't sleep in the same room, not yet, but our rooms felt less separate than they had before. I heard her moving just past the wall, brushing her teeth, flipping her light switch, settling into her bed. I lay there with my arm over my eyes, listening to the subtle ways people announce their presence when they think no one is paying attention. And I thought to myself how odd it was that the house hadn't changed at all, and yet it felt like it was holding its breath for something new to begin. I didn't dream that night, or if I did, I didn't remember it. But I woke up rested, not because I'd slept well, but because I hadn't gone to sleep bracing for anything. That, I realized, was what staying really meant, not just returning, physically, but waking without fear. The next morning, when I came into the kitchen, she handed me a mug and said, "You like your eggs scrambled, right?" And the fact that she remembered something I only said once weeks ago told me more than any poem or promise ever could. I nodded and smiled, and she turned back to the stove, and the smell of butter and salt and warmth filled the room. And, in that moment, without fireworks or speeches, I knew something had shifted. We weren't just walking parallel lives anymore. We were starting to merge. The thing about getting close to someone when you're no longer young is that it doesn't feel like falling. It feels like remembering, like rediscovering a part of yourself that had been buried beneath years of practicality, heartache, and lessons learned the hard way. There's no rush, no urgency, no desperate scramble to define what's happening. But there is a clarity that creeps in, a sobering awareness that time isn't endless, and that every moment spent holding back is a moment you don't get back. And it was with that slow understanding that our days began to feel a little heavier. Not in a way that made things harder, but in a way that made every glance, every touch, every small kindness carry a weight neither of us had the words for. Yet, we were moving closer, yes. But there was also this quiet, mutual pause between us, like we were both circling something delicate at the center of our growing connection. I started to notice how she would occasionally stop mid-sentence, like she was editing her thoughts before speaking, and I caught myself doing the same. There were moments when we laughed too loud at something small, and then went silent too quickly afterward, like we were both hearing echoes of something deeper underneath the surface. I began thinking about permanence, not in the way I used to, where the idea of staying in one place too long felt like a trap, but in the way permanence felt like safety, like peace, like something I didn't realize I was capable of craving until I was standing inside the quiet warmth of her kitchen, with a mug in my hand that wasn't mine but might as well have been. Still, neither of us pushed the moment. We danced around it instead, orbiting like satellites, measuring every step forward by instinct rather than intention. That morning, after breakfast, she mentioned that a friend of hers, an old college roommate, was coming into town the following week and staying for a few days. She said it casually, as if it were nothing, but I felt something shift in her voice. Not distance exactly, but caution. I didn't ask if the friend was a man or a woman. I didn't need to. The question wasn't really about that. The question, unspoken, was whether or not I would still be around when the guest arrived. Whether or not this thing between us, which had grown so naturally and without pretense, had room for the definitions that company often demands. I nodded, said I hoped they had a good visit, and went back to splitting kindling for the firewood pile. But my mind wasn't in the swing of the axe. It was in that space between knowing something has changed and deciding what to do about it. That night, I lingered a little longer on the porch after she went inside. The air had cooled early, and the sky was clear, the stars unbothered by our hesitations. I stared up at them and wondered how many people had sat in this exact spot, wondering if they were supposed to say something or let it stay unsaid. The next day, I didn't show up as early. I stopped by the market first, picked up a few things I didn't really need, loitered at the gas station too long, pretending to be interested in the headlines on magazines I'd never read. When I finally pulled into her drive, She was already outside tending the marigolds, hands in the soil, hair tied up, and when she saw me, her expression didn't change. No smile, no surprise, just recognition, as if she'd expected this kind of hesitation all along. I parked, stepped out, and handed her the small carton of strawberries I'd picked up from the market, and she took them with a soft thank you that hung in the air like a fragile thread between us. We didn't talk about why I was late. We didn't talk about next week. But something about the silence made it clear we were both thinking ahead, wondering how long we could go on like this without choosing to give it a name. I stayed through lunch, helped her clean out the shed, reorganized the storage bins, and fixed a leak under the kitchen sink that had been dripping slow and steady for weeks. She thanked me more than once that day, in that way people do when they're not just grateful for what you've done, but for the fact that you keep showing up. As I was about to leave that evening, standing at the edge of the porch, she reached for my hand. Not boldly, not dramatically, but enough to stop me. And in that brief touch, everything we hadn't said pulsed between us. I didn't pull away, but I didn't step forward either. I looked at her, really looked. And for the first time, I saw not just the woman in front of me, but the life she'd built, the scars she carried, the fears she masked with calm, and the hope she was trying not to pin too tightly to the way I lingered at her door. I squeezed her hand once, gentle, and whispered, "I'll be here tomorrow." And in that sentence lived 100 things we weren't yet ready to say out loud. Then I let go, stepped off the porch, and drove away slowly, knowing that if I came back the next day, I wouldn't be able to pretend anymore that this was just a visit. There's a certain pressure that builds when everything feels close to being said but nothing quite gets voiced, the kind of pressure that doesn't explode all at once, but instead settles behind every word, every gesture, every moment of silence. And over the next few days, that's exactly where we lived, in the space between what was obvious and what hadn't yet been acknowledged. I came back the next morning, as I said I would, and she greeted me with a quiet nod and a fresh mug of coffee, her hair still damp from the shower, no makeup, no preparation for anything beyond simply existing. And somehow that made her even more impossible to ignore. We didn't talk about the friend who was visiting next week. We didn't talk about the porch moment. Instead, we spent the day rebuilding the trellis behind her garden, pulling apart warped beams and piecing together something sturdier, something that might last longer this time. And maybe that was the metaphor hanging just out of reach. This quiet reconstruction, side by side, of something that needed new support before it could carry the weight of growth again. We worked in rhythm, not needing many words, occasionally brushing hands when passing tools or stepping into each other's path without stepping back. The dogs lounged in the grass nearby, occasionally lifting their heads as if to check in, but mostly just trusting the calm between us. She made lunch while I finished cleaning the tools, and when I stepped into the kitchen, I found her leaning over the stove, humming some half-remembered tune, lost in the moment in a way that made the whole room feel like a still frame from a life already shared. I stood there longer than I should have, not saying anything, just watching, just letting it settle how far we'd come from those first quiet days where everything was unfamiliar. She turned eventually, caught me mid-thought, and smiled. Not the polite kind, but the kind that acknowledged everything I wasn't saying. And for a second, I thought maybe that would be the moment. Maybe that would be when I finally said something that would make the air shift, the future bend in a more certain direction. But I didn't. I just smiled back, took the plate she handed me, and sat down. That night we ended up in the living room instead of the porch, rain tapping gently at the windows, a soft jazz record spinning low in the background. We each had a glass of wine, just one, and sat close on the couch, not touching but not far, the kind of distance that feels more like an invitation than a boundary. She asked me about my family, not out of obligation but because she genuinely wanted to know. And I found myself talking about things I hadn't said aloud in years. The brother I hadn't called in too long. The father who always worked too much and talked too little. The mother who taught me how to fix things but never how to stay. She listened without interruption, her eyes steady, her expression soft. And when I paused, unsure if I'd said too much, she reached for the remote and turned the volume down just a little more, like she was making space for me to continue. I didn't, not because I couldn't, but because what I'd said felt like enough for now. We sat there for a long time after that, letting the silence fold around us again. But this time it wasn't tense or uncertain. It was full. Full of the weight of shared presence, of things acknowledged without being explained. Eventually, she leaned her head against the back of the couch, closed her eyes, and whispered, "You know, I keep thinking that if I don't say it, maybe it'll stay perfect. Maybe it won't get real enough to break." I didn't reply right away. I let the truth of that settle, let it ripple across my chest like something warm and sharp at the same time. And then I said, "Maybe it gets better when it's real, or maybe it just gets different. But I don't think either of us came this far to pretend we don't want more." She opened her eyes, turned toward me slowly, and there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not fear, not longing, but readiness. Not for answers, maybe, but for honesty. I didn't kiss her then. That would have been too easy, too convenient a solution to a question we were both still forming. Instead, I reached over and took her hand. Not as a gesture of romance, not yet, but as a confirmation, a grounding, a silent agreement that whatever this was, we were both in it now, and neither of us needed to pretend otherwise. She squeezed back, just once, and the moment passed, but it left something behind. A crack in the dam, a doorway finally nudged open. When I left that night, I didn't look back over my shoulder like I usually did. I didn't need to. I knew exactly where I stood now. Not as a visitor, not as a handyman, not even as someone just passing through. I was a man being slowly, surely folded into the fabric of someone else's life, and it was terrifying. And it was beautiful. And it was starting to feel like home. The next morning felt different. Not because of anything that had happened exactly, but because the air between us was finally heavy with something undeniable, as if all the silence we'd let stretch between glances and gentle touches had finally taken shape into something that demanded to be addressed. I showed up with my usual coffee, the one I knew she liked now without needing to ask, and she greeted me with that quiet half-smile that had become a kind of ritual. But there was a pause in her step, a brief hesitation in her eyes that told me today might not be like the others. We walked around the garden like we always did, talking about the cucumbers finally sprouting and the crows that had been getting too bold. But the conversation didn't have the same easy rhythm. It was laced with something else. Anticipation, maybe. Or maybe fear. After a while, we ended up inside, both of us restless in the same quiet room, pretending we had things to do that we didn't. I fiddled with a drawer that stuck near the sink, and she rearranged books that had no reason to be moved. And at some point, we both ended up in the kitchen, standing just a little too close, not speaking, just listening to the faint tick of the clock on the wall. That's when she said it, not dramatically, not loudly, just a question dropped in the space like a stone in still water. "If I asked you to stay, not just today or next week, but to really stay, would you?" And the way she said it, steady and unblinking, told me this wasn't a hypothetical. This was her heart, bare and steady on the table between us. I didn't answer right away. I didn't look away either. I just let the question sit with me, let the weight of it settle into the quiet like it had always belonged there. I thought about all the days I'd spent here, the work we'd done, the coffee, the way she hummed to herself when she thought no one was listening, the soft crease between her eyebrows when she was thinking, the steadiness in her voice when she talked about things that used to hurt, and the way she never asked for more than what I gave, but always seemed to leave the door open for it anyway. I thought about the part of me that used to move from place to place, always leaving before anything rooted, always assuming permanence was something for other people. And then I thought about the way this house had stopped feeling like a job and started feeling like a place I looked forward to being, about how she had gone from someone I was helping to someone I didn't want to imagine days without. So I answered, yes, just that. Nothing more. Nothing poetic. Just the truth. Her breath caught, just a little, and for a second she didn't move. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me, not desperate or uncertain, but sure, like she'd finally allowed herself to believe that this thing she hoped for might not fall apart. I held her there, feeling the quiet shift into something whole, something real, and we didn't let go for a long time. When we finally stepped back, She didn't ask for conditions or explanations. She didn't need a plan. She just nodded and said, "Okay." And in that single word lived more commitment than all the promises I'd ever made and broken. From that moment on, the current between us wasn't tentative anymore. It wasn't trying to figure itself out. It was just there. Steady. Simple. Present. We moved through the rest of the day with that unspoken change wrapping around everything. She brushed her hand against mine more often. I found excuses to linger in rooms a little longer. She started cooking dinner for two without asking if I'd be staying, and I started leaving things behind like I had somewhere to return to. And even though we still hadn't used words like relationship or future or love, everything about the way we existed in that house now spoke volumes. That night, as we sat on the porch with our usual wine and soft music humming behind the screen door, she looked over and said, "It's funny. I used to think 52 was old. That this kind of thing, this beginning, wasn't meant for me anymore." I reached over, touched her hand lightly, and replied, "Maybe beginnings don't care about age. Maybe they just show up when they're ready." She smiled at that, but it was the kind of smile that carries history, relief, surprise, disbelief, that something good could still happen after everything else. And in that shared silence, I realized something else. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of staying, not of choosing, not of building something from scratch in a place I hadn't planned on with a woman who didn't need saving, just someone willing to let me in. It wasn't a fairy tale, it wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. The days that followed didn't explode with romance or unravel into grand declarations. They unfolded in smaller, quieter ways, the kind of ways you don't always recognize as important until you look back and realize how much weight they carried. Staying didn't mean everything was suddenly perfect. It just meant the rules had changed. There was a new stillness in the mornings now, not the kind born from hesitation, but the kind that comes when people have stopped performing, when comfort no longer has to prove itself. I began to wake earlier, not because I had work to do, but because I found something deeply peaceful in watching the light creep across her living room floor, in hearing her soft footsteps in the kitchen, and the clink of ceramic mugs, in knowing that for once, I didn't have to rush anywhere else. She still moved with her same easy grace, humming to herself while she watered the plants. But there was a warmth in her eyes now, a subtle shift in how she looked at me. Not with expectation or anxiety, but with calm assurance, like she had finally allowed herself to believe this was real. And I, too, found myself falling into new patterns, new instincts that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with belonging. I began replacing light bulbs without being asked, sweeping the porch before she noticed the leaves, filling up her car without mentioning it. None of it was choreographed, and none of it needed to be acknowledged. It just happened, as naturally as the sun moving across the sky. We weren't rushing into anything, but we weren't avoiding it either. One night she handed me a spare key without saying a word, and I didn't ask why. I just took it, slid it onto my keyring between two others that no longer mattered, and felt something settle inside me like a long exhale. But life doesn't stop testing you just because you've chosen to stay. If anything, it starts asking bigger questions. It's one thing to find peace in moments of quiet and affection. It's another to hold on to it when life starts pulling at the edges. The first pull came in the form of a call from my sister. One of those, we haven't talked in too long kind of check-ins that quickly veered into personal questions. She asked where I'd been lately, what I was doing, and when I hesitated before answering, she said, "Are you okay?" Like she didn't trust the silence. I told her I was fine, better than fine, actually. But I didn't offer many details. Not because I was hiding anything, but because some things still felt too tender to explain. Especially to someone who had only ever known me as the one who never stayed, the one who always left before anything could become too complicated. But after I hung up, I sat in the truck for a long time, watching the light flicker in the kitchen window, thinking about how much of my life had been lived without roots, how easily I used to justify leaving as a kind of self-preservation, when really it had been avoidance dressed up as wisdom. And now, here I was, still, present, invested. Not because it was convenient, but because it mattered more than my old reasons for running. The second test came when the hot water heater finally gave out. It was the kind of thing that would have caused a mild crisis in a different setting. But for us, it just became another piece of the story we were building. I spent the better part of a Saturday bent over in the crawl space, cursing old pipes and rusted bolts, while she handed me tools. Through the hatch, laughing when I smacked my head and joking that maybe I should have charged her more for this extended contract. At one point, covered in grime, I looked up and caught her watching me with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not amusement, not pity, but something closer to awe, like she couldn't believe I was still here, still under her house, still willing to be part of whatever came next. That night, as we sat on the floor in front of the fireplace, both of us too tired to move, she leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "I'm glad it was you." And I didn't ask what she meant, because I already knew. I knew she meant the leak, the mess, the days of silence, the shared dinners, the ache of the past, and the hope of the future. I knew she meant this life, however ordinary, however unscripted, and in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace without distance, love without the need for explanation. It wasn't a finish line. It wasn't a climax. It was just the soft, steady hum of a life beginning to take root in the places we used to protect. And as I stared into the firelight dancing across her face, I knew the tests weren't over, but I also knew I wasn't going anywhere. What no one tells you about building something real later in life is that even when the choice has been made, when the words have been said, and the days have started to stitch themselves into something resembling permanence, there are still ghosts that linger, silent, persistent reminders of who you used to be before the softness arrived. And for me, those ghosts didn't knock. They crept in slowly, quietly, usually in the stillness of the evening after the dishes had been washed and the wine had gone half warm in my glass. When she'd fall asleep with her hand near mine on the couch, and I'd stare at the ceiling wondering what it meant to stay forever. It wasn't doubt, not in her, not in us, but something more fragile than that. A hesitation that came from years of living just far enough away from closeness to avoid ever needing to confront my own capacity to be needed. Because being loved is one thing, but being depended on, that's where the cracks show up. She never asked me for more than I gave, but her silence sometimes did. The way she let me choose every day without question became its own kind of pressure, like I was always being trusted to stay until I didn't. And so one evening, when the sky was a shade of blue that made the whole house glow soft like a memory, I found myself restless in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. We'd had dinner, laughed about something trivial, listened to a few songs she'd found on an old playlist, and yet I couldn't settle. I excused myself early, claiming I had some paperwork to look over in the truck. An obvious lie, but one she didn't call me on. Instead, she just nodded, that calm way she always did, and said she'd be inside if I needed anything. I sat in the truck with the engine off, windows cracked, hands clenched around the steering wheel like I was bracing for impact. The truth was, I wasn't going anywhere, but I wanted to feel like I could. That freedom to leave, to pull away, had always been my escape hatch. And now that it wasn't needed, it felt strange not to know what to do with the urge. I thought about driving around the block just to breathe, to remember that I could still exist outside of us, but something in me held still. Maybe it was her voice in my head. Maybe it was the way she hadn't tried to hold me in place. Whatever it was, I stayed. Eventually, I came back inside. She was in the kitchen, drying the last of the dishes, humming to herself in that low, melodic way that always made the walls feel a little warmer. She didn't ask me where I'd been. She didn't ask me why I left. She just said, "You're back." And that one sentence hit harder than any question. Because in that moment, I realized something I hadn't been able to name before. She wasn't waiting for me to promise something permanent. She was just watching to see if I'd return on my own. The next morning, I brought it up, not directly, but in my own awkward, roundabout way. I told her I'd had a moment the night before, that old habits don't die easy, and sometimes fear dresses itself up as logic. She didn't flinch. She just nodded and said, "I know." as if she'd known all along and was just waiting for me to catch up. Then she said something I'll never forget. "I don't need you to be fearless. I just need you to be honest when you're not." That kind of grace, it breaks something open in a man. It makes you want to stay not because you're needed, but because you're understood. And after that, something softened in me. I didn't fight the quiet anymore. I didn't try to fill the spaces with reassurances or declarations. I just let the days come. Let them find their own rhythm. And in doing that, I started to realize that the foundation we'd built wasn't just made of moments. It was made of the choice to remain, day after day, thought after thought, even when the ghosts tried to whisper that it was all too good to be true. We started talking more about real things, not just memories, but hopes. She mentioned wanting to travel again, maybe see the coast, maybe drive through the desert in spring when the flowers came alive. I told her I'd never been to New Mexico and that maybe we should take the long way just to see what was there. She smiled and said, "That sounds like the right kind of slow." And in that moment I believed it. I believed in us. Not because we were flawless, but because we were still choosing each other even when the days weren't poetic. And that, more than anything else, meant we were already becoming something deeper than just two people who happened to be in the same place at the same time. We were becoming a home. It's strange how the end of something never really feels like the end when it's happening. There's no curtain call, no final note, no grand declaration that says, "This is it." Instead, it just folds into the quiet like everything else in life that becomes part of the background hum. For us, the shift wasn't seismic. It was subtle, like someone turning down the volume on all the old fears until what remained was just the sound of breathing, of coffee dripping in the kitchen, of a laugh that no longer carried a question mark at the end of it. We had landed, not with a thud, but with a soft exhale. And the house, this place that had once held the tension of possibility, now echoed with the weight of presence. Her chair was never empty anymore. My jacket stayed hung by the door. The air felt lived in, and I began to notice how quickly time moved when it stopped being counted in maybes. We didn't need to explain it to each other. That had always been the difference between this and everything before. With her, I didn't have to articulate the reasons I stayed or name the way I felt each time I saw her move through a room like she belonged there. She just did. And I did too. I caught myself smiling at small things. Her mismatched socks, the way she twisted her hair up before bed, the old wind chime she'd finally hung by the porch that never made the same sound twice. I started to love those irregular sounds, the asymmetry of our days. They reminded me that we weren't trying to get it right. We were just trying to be real. There were moments where nothing happened, and those became my favorites. A Sunday afternoon stretched across hours, with her curled up reading in the armchair while I dozed on the couch, the dog snoring beneath the window. A thunderstorm that knocked out the power for an hour, and we didn't light candles right away because the dark was just as comfortable. An unexpected visit from an old friend of hers who looked surprised to find me still there. And even more, surprised when she introduced me as home. That word, home. It meant something different now. It wasn't about walls or roofs or locks on doors. It was about warmth in a room when she walked in. It was about being met with understanding when I didn't have the words for what I was feeling. It was about the comfort of being known fully and still chosen. I used to think love was about promises, about saying the right thing at the right time, about showing up in grand gestures that could be photographed or remembered. But that wasn't love. Not for us. Love was letting the laundry pile up because the conversation was too good to interrupt. Love was letting silence stretch between us and not feeling the need to fill it. Love was picking out groceries together and arguing about the best kind of cheese, then laughing because neither of us cared that much, but it felt like we should. There was one morning, long after everything had fallen into place, where I woke up before her and just watched the way the early light cut across her face. There were lines there, real ones. The kind time gives you when it's not trying to be kind. But they didn't bother me. They grounded me. I didn't see age. I saw all the days she had survived to become this person who could smile in her sleep and not flinch when I reached for her hand. I didn't realize I was staring until her eyes opened slowly, and without even blinking, she said, "You're doing that thing again." I asked what thing, and she smiled without moving. "The thing where you look at me like you're not sure if this is real." And she was right. Because even after everything, there was still a small part of me that hadn't entirely caught up to the idea that someone could love me in the quiet, without performance, without needing me to earn it every day. But her gaze, steady and soft, told me I didn't have to wonder anymore. She wasn't going anywhere, and neither was I. We had never talked about marriage, not seriously. It wasn't that we were against it. It just never felt necessary. Commitment to us wasn't something you proved on paper. It was what you did every morning when you stayed. It was in the way we memorized each other's routines without trying. The way she always left the tea kettle just off center on the stove because she said it whistled too loudly otherwise. And the way I learned to put the cutting board in the dishwasher even though I'd always hand-washed it before. These were the things that made us work. Not ceremony, not symbolism, but surrender. A mutual understanding that we were two people with sharp edges, who had stopped trying to grind each other smooth, and instead learned how to hold on without drawing blood. The neighbors started noticing. I'd get nods now from the old men on their porches when I walked by with the dog. The barista at the coffee shop started asking if I wanted the usual, instead of pretending I was a stranger each time. People began to recognize me, not as the man fixing her roof, but as part of her story. It felt good, not because I needed their approval, but because it confirmed what we already knew, that what we had was visible, tangible, undeniable. I wasn't her secret, and she wasn't my escape. We were something else entirely, something durable. One night we hosted a small dinner, just 4 or 5 people, nothing extravagant. But it was the first time we'd done something like that. I watched her laugh across the table, watched the way she poured wine into a friend's glass without missing a beat in the story she was telling, and I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear, but gratitude. Pure, breath-catching gratitude. Because here she was, this woman who had once asked me if I'd stay even if she was 52. And here I was, years later, still holding that answer in every action I made. The days kept coming, not in a blur but with a kind of softness that made them indistinguishable in the best way. There wasn't a need to keep track of time anymore. We marked progress not by calendars or milestones, but by the feel of her hand in mine as we stood in the garden, by the way the house creaked differently when the temperature dropped, by how our shadows fell next to each other at the end of the day. I started to notice how deeply rooted we'd become when I found myself fixing things before they broke, tightening a bolt that had only just started to loosen, refilling the salt in the softener before she even mentioned it, cleaning the gutters before the first leaf fell, not because I was trying to impress her, but because I finally understood what it meant to care for something long-term. Not just reactively, but preemptively, like love itself was a kind of maintenance, a quiet attention to detail that never announced itself but made all the difference in the long run. She noticed too, though she rarely said it aloud. I could see it in the way her shoulders lowered when I stepped into a room, like my presence wasn't a disruption but a kind of exhale, like she could finally stop bracing herself for disappointment. I never thought I'd love the ordinary so much. Waking up at the same time, drinking from the same mug, folding the same laundry. I used to think routine was a slow death, the kind of thing that chipped away at your identity until you forgot who you were. But now I understood that routine wasn't a cage. It was a rhythm. And rhythm was the heartbeat of something lasting. We weren't stagnant, we were steady. There was a huge difference. Our quiet life wasn't the result of fear or failure. It was the result of effort, of two people choosing peace over chaos, consistency over drama. We didn't need storms to feel alive. We had each other. And that was enough. More than enough. She began to collect books again, filling shelves with titles she'd loved in her 20s but hadn't read in years. I found a small record player at a thrift shop and fixed it up. Saturday mornings became our time to spin vinyl, sipping coffee while the needle popped and crackled through jazz and old soul. It was simple, but it was real. And that was everything. There was a weekend, sometime in the fall, when we went away, not far. Just a cabin in the woods about 2 hours north. No cell service. No TV. Just trees, firewood, and long walks. It was the first time we'd been alone in a new place together, and I wondered for a moment if the magic would fade outside. The walls we'd built, but it didn't. If anything, it deepened. Watching her light a fire, watching the way she curled her legs up beneath her on the old couch, how she talked to herself when she cooked. Even there, in the unfamiliar, she brought the same stillness with her. And I realized then that it wasn't the house that made this work. It wasn't the rituals or the routines or even the shared space. It was her. She was the home. She was the firelight and the quiet mornings and the steady hand on my shoulder. She was the reason I could breathe differently now. The reason I didn't flinch at closeness anymore. And I made a silent vow that night, sitting beside her in the dark cabin while the wind brushed against the windows, that I'd never leave again. Not her. Not this. She told me once that she used to dream of running away. That there were whole nights where she'd lie awake and imagine a version of herself that could just disappear. Start over somewhere no one knew her name or her history. I asked if she still felt that way sometimes. She shook her head and said, "Not anymore. Not since you." And I believed her. Not because I needed to, but because she wasn't the kind of person to say something unless she meant it. That's what I'd come to love most. Her clarity, her honesty. The way she never hid behind politeness or pretended to be fine when she wasn't. There were days when she was short-tempered, where she retreated into herself and didn't speak until dinner. But she always came back. And she never made me guess why. That kind of emotional transparency had once terrified me. Now it felt like the only way I could live. When winter came, we leaned into the season. We cooked hearty meals, lit the fireplace almost every night, played board games and read novels aloud to each other when the storms knocked out the power. We made the cold feel like a gift, a reason to stay close. I started keeping a journal, not because I had anything profound to say, but because I wanted to remember. I didn't want to forget the way her hand felt in mine during a snowstorm, or the way she'd laugh when the dog tried to catch snowflakes midair. I wrote down the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching, the way her breath formed little clouds in the morning when she stepped out onto the porch wrapped in a blanket. These were the things that built our life, not the big milestones, but the accumulation of small, perfect nothings. She began calling the dog Ours. She said it casually one day, "Ours needs a new collar." And I froze for a second, letting the weight of that word sink in. It wasn't about ownership. It was about inclusion. I wasn't separate anymore. I wasn't an add-on or a visitor. I was part of the whole. And in that moment I realized I hadn't felt that way since I was a child, since before the world taught me that belonging came with conditions. But with her, it didn't. It was unconditional, rooted, quietly permanent. There was a night, not long after, when I found her sitting at the kitchen table long after I'd gone to bed. The lights were off. The only glow came from the streetlight filtering through the blinds. She had a letter in her hand. I didn't ask what it said. I didn't need to. She looked up at me, eyes red but not broken, and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I walked over, wrapped my arms around her from behind, and said nothing, because sometimes silence says more than words ever can. Spring returned slowly, as it always did in that part of the country. The snow didn't melt all at once. It receded in patches, like it was reluctant to leave, clinging to the corners of the yard and the shaded bends in the road. But the air grew softer, the light lingered longer, and we began to open the windows again. The house filled with birdsong and the scent of damp earth. She planted new flowers in the garden, ones I couldn't name but that she remembered from her grandmother's yard. I built her a trellis out of old wood we'd saved from when we first repaired the roof, and she cried when I showed it to her, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. We'd taken something broken and turned it into something that held life. That was the story of us. One night, we walked the perimeter of the property, the way we did sometimes when the moon was bright enough to guide us without flashlights. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. Our footsteps synced. Our breath fell into the same rhythm, and somewhere along the northern edge, where the trees thinned out and the land opened up toward the old creek, she stopped, turned to me and said, "This is it. This is what I dreamed of. Not the house, not the land, but the feeling." I knew exactly what she meant. We were older now. Not old, but not young either. There were more lines on our faces, more softness around the edges. My back ached more often. She started wearing glasses when she read, but none of it felt like loss. It felt like gain. Like every year we'd survived had carved out space for something richer. There was no need for chasing anymore. We didn't need to prove ourselves, not to each other and not to the world. The love we had wasn't loud or dramatic. It was consistent, reliable, deep. It was in the way we folded each other's laundry without being asked, in the way she always saved me the last slice of pie, even though it was her favorite, in the way I turned down the bed before she got there so it was warm when she slid in. These were the small acts that built cathedrals, the sacred made mundane. I realized one morning, while washing dishes and watching her read at the table, that I would have missed this if I'd kept chasing the life I thought I wanted. The kind with more travel, more adrenaline, more everything. I would have missed the peace of stillness, the comfort of repetition, the miracle of someone knowing you, truly knowing you, and choosing you anyway. There came a day, years later, when the roof needed fixing again. Not the whole thing, just a section. And as I climbed the ladder, now slower, knees stiffer than before, I felt her watching me from below, just like that first day so long ago. Except now, there was no nervousness in her eyes, only trust, only history. I finished the job in a couple of hours and came down to find her waiting with a glass of lemonade, her hair tied back, her smile lined but radiant. She handed me the glass and said, "You still got it." And I laughed because it was true, but not in the way it used to be. I still had strength, but more than that, I had presence, I had patience, I had roots. We sat on the porch afterward, legs brushing, and watched the shadows stretch across the yard. And it hit me that I didn't need a photograph to remember this. I'd carry it in my bones forever. Eventually, time did what time always does. It moved on. Some friends drifted, some passed. We started writing things down more often, not out of fear of forgetting, but out of reverence for the remembering. She kept a notebook by the bed. I kept one by the shed. We'd trade them sometimes, read what the other had written, notes, quotes, memories, hopes. It became our quiet tradition, a shared archive of a life built from a question that once seemed absurd. Would you stay, even if I'm 52? And now, all these years later, the answer remained the same. Yes. 1,000 times. Yes. Not in the romantic sense of a movie. Ending, not in a blaze of glory, but in the way that mattered most, in the mundane, in the repetition, in the knowing, in every dish washed, in every garden weeded, in every gentle good night and every sleepy good morning. We didn't measure love in intensity anymore. We measured it in constancy. And so, the days unfolded like pages in a well-worn book, each one familiar, yet still worth turning. The seasons passed, not unnoticed, but unresisted. We didn't cling to youth, and we didn't fear age. We simply lived. Fully. Presently. With gratitude for what had been and with quiet curiosity for whatever would come next. In the end, love wasn't something we found. It was something we chose, day after day, in 1,000 small ways. And long after the roof had been fixed, long after the question had been asked and answered, we were still here, together, still choosing, still becoming. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.